I had always thought that my relationship with my brother was solid. We grew up together, shared secrets, laughed at the same dumb jokes, and even had that unspoken bond that only siblings seem to understand. People would look at us and say, "Wow, you two are inseparable." And I believed them, I truly did. But life has a way of revealing truths we'd rather not face, and sometimes the people closest to us can drift away in ways that leave us stunned, confused, and honestly, heartbroken. I never saw it coming, not even in my wildest imaginings. It started with small things, subtle shifts that I dismissed as inconsequential. Maybe he was busy, maybe work was stressful, maybe he just needed some space. I told myself these stories repeatedly, crafting excuses for his sudden lack of communication. But when weeks stretched into months without so much as a, "Hey, how are you?" I began to feel the gnawing suspicion that something was seriously wrong. I reached out, careful, cautious, trying to not overwhelm him, but the replies came slower and slower until eventually they stopped altogether. And just like that, my brother, the person I thought I knew inside and out, seemed to vanish from my life. I can't describe the weight of that silence. At first, I tried to rationalize it, creating endless mental scenarios. Maybe he was angry at something I had said. Maybe I had unknowingly offended him. Maybe he was dealing with his own problems and didn't know how to tell me. I went over every conversation, every text, every fleeting interaction, analyzing, replaying, searching desperately for a clue about what had gone wrong. But the harder I looked, the emptier it felt. There was no explanation, just absence. And absence, as I quickly learned, has a sound all its own. The worst part was the uncertainty. When someone cuts you off without explanation, your mind begins to spiral. You second-guess yourself endlessly. You try to remember every slight, every disagreement, every time you may have been thoughtless or careless. And in the silence, your imagination fills in the blanks, often with the worst possible scenarios. I found myself lying awake at night, thinking about the last conversation we had, dissecting it word by word. Did I say something wrong? Did I hurt him without realizing it? Did I fail him somehow? It was exhausting, emotionally draining, and yet I couldn't stop. There was no closure, and no closure means no peace. I decided to reach out one last time, tentatively, carefully choosing my words. I sent a message that was simple, heartfelt, and non-confrontational, something that could open a door without slamming it down. I wrote, "I miss you. I don't know what happened, but I hope we can talk." I hit send and immediately felt the mix of hope and dread that anyone who has loved someone deeply and then lost them without warning knows all too well. And then, nothing. No reply. Not a single word. Just the cold, empty void of digital silence. It hurt in ways I didn't expect. Not just sadness, but anger, confusion, and even a sense of betrayal. I wanted to scream, to demand answers, to understand why someone I had loved and trusted could simply erase me from their life. But yelling into the void doesn't change anything. And the reality is, sometimes people leave, sometimes they cut ties, and sometimes they never give you a reason. It's a bitter pill to swallow, but swallowing it is part of learning how to navigate life when relationships crumble unexpectedly. And yet, in the midst of this pain, I began to notice something strange. Memories I had taken for granted started to surface in a different light. The little things he used to do, laughing at terrible puns, leaving his laundry in odd places, the way he would always tease me even when I was grumpy, they began to feel like treasures I had overlooked. It's funny how absence can make the heart notice details it ignored when someone was physically present. I realized that the bond we had wasn't just in shared experiences. It was in the consistency, the everyday acts of connection that I had taken for granted until they were gone. I began to wonder if maybe, just maybe, the distance wasn't entirely his choice. Could it be that I had been too wrapped up in my own life to notice his struggles? Could I have been blind to the signs that he was hurting or pulling away? I wanted answers, but the universe rarely hands them to you neatly packaged. Instead, you're left to sift through your own thoughts, reflect on your own actions, and decide what you're willing to accept. And sometimes, acceptance doesn't come with closure. It comes with the quiet decision to keep moving forward even when your heart is still aching. I remembered a conversation we had years ago, one that seemed trivial at the time. He had told me, "I don't like holding grudges. If someone's upset with me, I want to know." I had nodded, laughing it off, thinking we both believed that same philosophy. But life is never that simple, and people change, feelings fester, silence grows, and what once felt like a bond unbreakable can suddenly feel fragile, tenuous, like it's hanging by a thread you didn't even know was there. I reached out to mutual friends, hoping for insight, something that could shed light on this sudden chasm between us. But the answers were vague, hesitant, or non-existent. It became clear that this wasn't about me, or at least not entirely about me. He was going through something, or perhaps making choices that I couldn't understand, and that, I realized, was a difficult truth. Sometimes you can't control how someone else navigates their life, and sometimes you can't even understand it, no matter how much you love them. The days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months. Life moved forward, but the absence remained. I learned to cope, to redirect my energy, to fill the spaces left behind with reflection, growth, and small acts of self-care. I wrote letters I never sent. I journaled about my feelings. I tried to see the situation from his perspective, imagining the world through his eyes, trying to find empathy where there was pain. It wasn't easy, and some days were harder than others, but slowly I started to reclaim pieces of myself that had been lost in the confusion and heartache. Through this process, I discovered something profound. Relationships, even the most sacred ones, are complex. They're not always linear. They don't always make sense, and sometimes the people we love most will leave us in ways that feel inexplicable. But in that departure lies an opportunity, a painful, challenging, and sometimes beautiful opportunity to learn, grow, and find resilience we didn't know we possessed. The absence of my brother forced me to confront emotions I had never faced, to examine my own expectations, and to reconsider what connection really means. And so I stand here months later, still feeling the sting of that sudden disconnection, but also carrying a newfound understanding. Life is unpredictable, people change, bonds shift, and while I may never know exactly why my brother cut me off, I do know this: the love I had for him and the experiences we shared continue to shape me. They continue to inform how I approach relationships, empathy, and forgiveness. And in the quiet moments, when the memory of his laughter or his teasing drifts into my mind, I remember that even when people leave, their impact can remain, a reminder of what once was and what still shapes who we are. After months of trying to reconcile, a part of me started to accept the reality. My brother might not come back, not right away, and maybe not ever. And yet, acceptance didn't erase the emptiness that followed me through everyday life. I noticed it in the quiet moments, the little spaces he used to occupy. At the kitchen table, I would sip my coffee and expect him to be there, joking about some trivial nonsense. In the car, I'd reach for the phone to send him a funny meme, only to remember that he was no longer just a text away. The absence was a ghost, quietly shadowing me, reminding me of the gap his disappearance had left in my world. I realized that I had been clinging to the past, trying desperately to reconstruct a relationship that might never return to its previous form, and the harder I clung, the more I felt myself unravel. It's strange how relationships shape us even when they're absent. We think that distance will lessen our feelings, but often it only magnifies them. The silence made me hyper-aware of every detail I had shared with him, every argument we had ever had, every laughter-filled night we spent together. And in that magnified awareness came a painful clarity. Some things can't be fixed, at least not on our schedule. I began to reflect on our childhood, trying to understand the man he had become and the path that led him to shut me out. We had been close, inseparable even, but even then there were moments that hinted at the subtle differences in our personalities. He was fiercely independent, sometimes stubborn to the point of recklessness. I was more cautious, often overthinking everything. I wondered if those differences, once insignificant, had grown into barriers that neither of us knew how to cross. Perhaps he felt misunderstood, perhaps I had inadvertently hurt him, or perhaps it wasn't about me at all. The uncertainty was exhausting, but it was also a lens through which I began to see our relationship more honestly. In the weeks that followed, I tried reaching out again, this time with a different approach. I stopped expecting immediate responses or clear explanations. I sent short messages, occasionally sharing memories or things I thought he might appreciate. A song, a photo, a small anecdote. I avoided pressure, avoided confrontation, avoided anything that might push him further away. And still, the silence persisted. But through this subtle attempt at connection, I learned something unexpected. Sometimes showing that you care doesn't require acknowledgement. Sometimes it's enough to simply put your intention into the world and let it exist, even if it never returns to you. I also realized that my grief wasn't just about losing my brother's presence. It was about losing the version of myself that existed when he was around. Our relationship had been so intertwined with my identity that without him, I felt unmoored. It's a peculiar kind of grief, the kind that doesn't come from death but from withdrawal, from absence, from the quiet erosion of a bond you had taken for granted. And coping with that grief required patience, reflection, and above all, compassion for myself. I had to remind myself that it wasn't my fault, that life sometimes unfolds in ways beyond our control, and that relationships, no matter how profound, can be fragile. During this time, I turned inward, exploring parts of my life and character that had been dormant while I focused on him. I started journaling, pouring out thoughts that I had previously reserved for conversations with him. I revisited hobbies we used to share, like hiking and photography, but now I experienced them alone, noticing details that had gone unnoticed before. The solitude was not easy, but it was transformative. It forced me to confront my own emotions, to understand my own patterns, and to learn that even in absence, connection is possible, not with him, but with myself. And yet, there were moments when anger flared up, not at him, not really, but at the unfairness of it all. I would think, why would someone I love so deeply choose to vanish without explanation? The question haunted me, looping endlessly in my mind. I knew, logically, that there could be countless reasons beyond my understanding, but the logic didn't always soothe the heart. Emotional wounds aren't easily reasoned away. Sometimes you have to sit with them, hold them tenderly, and let them teach you resilience. And that's exactly what I began to do. Hold the discomfort, lean into it, and find meaning in what felt senseless. Slowly, a new awareness emerged. I began to see the complexities of human behavior, the ways people protect themselves, the walls they build, the silent battles they fight alone. My brother's choice to cut me off, while deeply painful, could have been an act of self-preservation, a way of coping with struggles I couldn't see. It was humbling, really, to consider that someone I loved could be experiencing pain that had nothing to do with me, yet still affected me so profoundly. Empathy became both a balm and a mirror, reflecting my own capacity for understanding and my own need for forgiveness, both for him and for myself. In exploring this empathy, I also revisited the idea of closure. I had spent months seeking it externally, waiting for him to provide explanations or apologies. But as time passed, I realized that closure often comes from within. Waiting for him to justify, explain, or validate my feelings was a trap. It placed my peace entirely in someone else's hands. And so I made a conscious choice. I would find my own closure. I would reflect on the lessons learned, embrace the love that had existed, and let go of what I could not control. It was not about excusing his behavior. It was about reclaiming my life and my emotional well-being. In tandem with this internal work, I noticed the world around me differently. Relationships that had once seemed ordinary now felt precious. I began investing more time in friends, nurturing family bonds that were still intact, and reaching out to people I had neglected. The absence of my brother illuminated the value of connection in ways I hadn't appreciated before. Every conversation, every laugh, every shared experience became a reminder that while loss is inevitable, presence is fleeting, and gratitude is vital. Despite the pain, there were also moments of quiet joy. I discovered that I could laugh again without guilt, enjoy solitary adventures without feeling incomplete, and appreciate life in a way that was independent of my brother's presence. These small victories, these micro moments of growth, were the foundation of healing. They reminded me that even when relationships fracture, life continues, offering opportunities for love, understanding, and self-discovery in forms we may never have imagined. Through all this, I kept the hope alive that someday, perhaps, our paths might converge again. But that hope was no longer a desperate longing, it became a gentle, realistic wish. I learned to accept uncertainty without letting it dominate my life. I could imagine reconciliation, but I also accepted the possibility that it might never come. And in that delicate balance of hope and acceptance, I found a measure of peace that had been absent for months. I found myself constantly revisiting our childhood memories, trying to understand the essence of the bond we once had. I remember the times we would sneak into the kitchen late at night, trying to steal snacks without waking our parents, laughing so hard we would almost cry. Those moments seemed trivial at the time, but now, in the stark absence of his presence, they felt monumental, like fragments of a life I could no longer touch. I thought about the endless summers spent riding our bikes until sunset, racing through empty streets, daring each other to push a little further, a little faster, a little bolder. He was fearless then, a whirlwind of energy and confidence, while I hesitated at every corner, cautious and calculating. Yet somehow we balanced each other perfectly. Those memories were bittersweet. They reminded me of everything I had lost, but they also reminded me of who we were at our best. We weren't perfect, far from it, but the way we complemented each other created something rare. And in reflecting on those moments, I realized just how much I had taken for granted. I had assumed he would always be there, that the bond we shared was impervious to life's complexities. I hadn't considered that people grow apart, that paths diverge, and that love, no matter how deep, doesn't always guarantee proximity. As I thought about the present, I couldn't help but contrast it with the past. The laughter, the teasing, the shared secrets, all of it had evaporated. What remained was a silence that felt both heavy and accusatory. It was as if his absence carried a hidden judgment. You didn't do enough. You weren't enough. You failed somehow. And even though I knew rationally that this wasn't true, the emotional weight was undeniable. Human minds have a way of filling voids with questions and blame, often where none is warranted. I had to remind myself constantly that absence doesn't always equate to rejection, and silence doesn't always equate to condemnation. In the quiet moments, I began to imagine the life he might be leading now. Was he struggling silently, wrestling with decisions I couldn't fathom, or was he thriving, moving on with a resolve that excluded me by necessity or choice? I wanted to reach out again, but fear held me back. Fear of rejection, fear of making things worse, fear of confirming that our connection had truly ended, and yet the desire to reconnect, to bridge the gap, lingered stubbornly, refusing to be ignored. It was a tug-of-war between hope and apprehension, one that left me emotionally exhausted but strangely alive. I realized slowly that my longing for answers was a reflection not just of my love for him, but of my own need for understanding and closure. I needed to reconcile my memories of who he was with the reality of who he had become, or at least the reality of his current absence. And in doing so, I began to explore the idea that closure might not come from him. Perhaps it could only come from me. Maybe the act of processing, of reflecting, of learning to hold both love and pain simultaneously was the closure I had been seeking all along. I started writing letters that I never sent. Each one was an attempt to articulate everything I felt: anger, sadness, confusion, longing, and even love. I wrote about our childhood, our teenage years, and the subtle shifts in our relationship that I now recognized with painful clarity. I poured out questions I would never have answers to, confessions I could never voice aloud, and memories that had been tucked away in corners of my mind. Writing became a form of therapy, a way to hold my emotions without the expectation of response, a way to honor the bond we shared even as it changed. One letter in particular stands out. I described a day from our teenage years when we had a massive argument over something trivial, a borrowed video game, I think. We had shouted, stormed off, and then refused to speak for days. Yet, in the end, we reconciled with a simple handshake and a reluctant grin. I wrote about how those small reconciliations shaped my understanding of forgiveness, patience, and unconditional love. The irony wasn't lost on me. Our childhood conflicts seemed trivial now, yet they contained lessons about connection that were profoundly relevant to the situation I faced today. It was during this period of reflection that I began to notice subtle shifts in my own perspective. I realized that my brother's absence had forced me to grow in ways I hadn't anticipated. I had developed patience, empathy, and resilience. I had learned to sit with discomfort, to tolerate ambiguity, and to embrace the complexity of human relationships. In essence, the void he left behind became a space for self-discovery, a mirror reflecting not only what I had lost, but also what I could gain. And yet, despite these insights, the pain remained. The holidays were the hardest. Sitting at the dinner table without him, hearing stories from friends about sibling antics, or watching videos of families celebrating together, it all felt like a cruel reminder of the connection I no longer had. I found myself oscillating between nostalgia and longing, between anger and compassion, between the hope of reconciliation and the resignation of acceptance. It was exhausting, emotionally draining, and yet, strangely, transformative. I began talking to close friends about my experience, seeking their perspectives. Their insights were invaluable. Some reminded me that people sometimes leave not because of us, but because of circumstances beyond our control. Others shared similar stories, which helped normalize my feelings and reduce the isolation I had felt. Through these conversations, I realized that while my brother's choices were deeply personal, my reactions and growth were entirely within my control. This realization empowered me. I could not dictate his actions, but I could shape my own emotional landscape, my own capacity for forgiveness, and my own journey forward. One particularly poignant moment came when I revisited old photos of us together. I found an image of us as children, tangled in a pile of blankets, laughing so hard that our eyes were watery. Looking at that photo, I felt a mixture of sorrow and gratitude, sorrow for what had been lost, and gratitude for having experienced it at all. It reminded me that relationships, no matter how temporary or fractured, leave an indelible mark on our lives. Even when the bond shifts or dissolves, its influence persists in subtle, enduring ways. As I continued to navigate this emotional landscape, I realized that my identity had become intertwined with my relationship with him. Losing contact forced me to reevaluate who I was outside of that connection. I explored hobbies I had neglected, invested more in friendships, and pursued goals I had deferred. In doing so, I discovered facets of myself that I had overlooked, capacities I had underestimated, and a resilience I hadn't known I possessed. The absence of my brother, painful as it was, had inadvertently opened the door to a richer, more self-aware version of myself. By now, I had begun to understand the nuanced truth about human relationships. Love doesn't always equate to proximity. Bonds aren't always visible, and sometimes absence doesn't signify the end. People leave, sometimes temporarily, sometimes permanently, and the reasons can be as complex and varied as life itself. The challenge isn't in making sense of their choices, it's in learning to navigate your own emotions, honor your own growth, and maintain compassion even when the situation seems inexplicable. As the months passed, I noticed that my emotional landscape had shifted in ways I hadn't expected. The acute sting of his absence remained, but it had begun to soften, replaced by a quiet curiosity about who he had become in my absence. I started imagining what his daily life might look like, what challenges he faced, what victories he celebrated, what private moments of reflection he experienced. It was a strange exercise, balancing my longing with my imagination, filling in gaps with empathy rather than judgment. I had no answers, but I had a growing understanding that sometimes people's choices reflect their own struggles and not the measure of your worth or love. I began experimenting with subtle, indirect ways to reconnect. I would comment on social media posts, send shared memories through messaging apps, or tag him in things I knew he cared about. I never demanded a response, never pressured him, simply left little breadcrumbs that signaled, "I'm still here, I care, and I'm thinking of you." Sometimes the messages were ignored, and sometimes they lingered without reaction. Each instance, regardless of outcome, became a lesson in patience and restraint. I realized that love doesn't always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it exists quietly, persistently, without expectation. During this period, I also revisited our arguments, particularly the minor conflicts that had escalated over time. I reflected on my own behavior, acknowledging moments when I may have been insensitive, defensive, or self-absorbed. It wasn't about blame, it was about understanding the dynamics that shaped our relationship. I recognized patterns I hadn't seen before: his tendency to withdraw when stressed, my tendency to push for answers, the way minor frustrations could compound into misunderstandings. Insight without judgment became a crucial tool, allowing me to analyze our relationship with clarity and compassion. And yet, there were moments when resentment crept in. I felt anger, a deep, gnawing frustration that he could disappear so completely from my life. I questioned the fairness of it all, the emotional labor I had invested, and the pain that his absence had caused. It was a natural response, I reminded myself, a reflection of the bond we once shared. But I refused to let anger dominate my thoughts. I learned to hold it alongside love, grief, and hope, recognizing that complex emotions often coexist, even when they feel contradictory. I also noticed how this experience changed the way I approached relationships outside my family. I became more attentive to friends, more intentional in nurturing bonds that I had once taken for granted. I realized that absence can illuminate the fragility of connection, making you cherish the moments of presence all the more. Every interaction became an opportunity to listen more deeply, to be more patient, to give fully without expectation. The absence of my brother, paradoxically, made me more present in other relationships. As time went on, I began to accept that my brother's absence might remain indefinite. And in accepting that, I started to explore my own identity independent of his influence. I took up activities we had enjoyed together, cycling, hiking, even the occasional video game session, but now experienced them alone, discovering new layers of enjoyment and self-reliance. The solitude was initially painful, but gradually, it became empowering. I learned that absence doesn't have to signify loss entirely. It can also open space for self-discovery, growth, and resilience. I also reflected on the concept of forgiveness, not in the sense of excusing behavior, but in releasing the emotional hold his absence had over me. I realized that holding on to hurt would only perpetuate pain and limit my ability to move forward. Forgiveness, I discovered, wasn't about reconciliation with him. It was about reconciling with myself, finding peace, and reclaiming control over my emotions. It was a subtle, quiet process, unfolding in private moments of reflection, journaling, and self-talk. One evening, I found myself staring at a photo of us as teenagers, our arms slung over each other's shoulders, grinning like nothing in the world could go wrong. It struck me how those small, ordinary moments carried profound meaning. They weren't grand gestures, but they encapsulated trust, companionship, and shared joy. And even though the present was different, those memories remained untouched by time or absence. I realized that relationships leave imprints on our hearts that no distance can erase. They evolve, shift, and sometimes fade, but their influence persists. I also began to consider the possibility that my brother might one day return to my life, not necessarily to restore things to how they were, but to forge something new. I allowed myself to imagine that scenario with hope rather than desperation. I pictured a conversation where we could acknowledge the distance, share unspoken thoughts, and perhaps even laugh about our old arguments. It was a delicate, fragile hope, but it was sustaining. And even if it never materialized, imagining it gave me a framework for processing the grief, for holding space for potential reconciliation without being dependent on it. Meanwhile, I confronted the reality that life continues, with or without the people we hope will remain. I found myself celebrating small victories, appreciating moments of connection with friends, and embracing opportunities that I might have overlooked had I been consumed by longing. It was a lesson in resilience, learning to thrive, not just survive, in the face of emotional uncertainty. The absence of my brother became a catalyst for self-awareness, a mirror reflecting both my vulnerabilities and my strengths. During this reflective period, I noticed an unexpected emotional shift. I began to feel gratitude for the time we had shared, rather than focusing solely on the gap his absence had created. I remembered his quirks, his laughter, the subtle ways he had supported me without words. And in that gratitude, I discovered a gentle, soothing peace, a recognition that even if our paths diverged, our shared history remained a source of warmth and understanding. The absence became less of a void and more of a space for reflection, growth, and appreciation. There came a moment, several months into this journey of absence and reflection, when I realized that my desire for answers had shifted. I no longer sought explanations to validate my feelings or to assign blame. Instead, I wanted understanding, not just of him, but of life, of relationships, of the fragile nature of human connection. I recognized that his choice to withdraw was a reflection of his reality, not a judgment of my worth. This insight didn't erase the pain, but it reframed it, giving me a perspective that was both liberating and sobering. I began to see our past interactions in a new light. Arguments that once felt monumental now appeared as fleeting moments in a much larger story. Misunderstandings, overlooked gestures, and the unspoken frustrations we carried didn't define the entirety of our bond. They were parts of a tapestry, intricate and flawed, yet beautiful in their complexity. This reframing helped me hold the paradox of our relationship, love and distance, connection and absence, laughter and sorrow, simultaneously real and inseparable. During this time, I also noticed a subtle shift in my emotional resilience. The pain was still present, but it no longer dominated my daily thoughts. I found myself able to focus on other areas of my life without feeling as though I was betraying him or the relationship we had shared. I began pursuing projects I had postponed, investing in friendships I had taken for granted, and nurturing my own growth. The absence of my brother became a catalyst for self-reliance, a reminder that while relationships shape us, our identity ultimately resides within ourselves. One afternoon, I found myself walking through a park we used to frequent together. The path was lined with trees that had witnessed countless shared moments, games of tag, spirited debates over which movie to watch, and laughter that echoed through the air. I paused, imagining him beside me, sharing in the same simple joy. The emptiness was palpable, but it was accompanied by a strange sense of connection. Memories, I realized, are not bound by physical presence. They linger, shaping us, reminding us of what was, and subtly guiding us toward who we might become. In reflecting on his absence, I also considered the ways I had tried to bridge the gap. Every message sent, every memory shared, every subtle attempt at reconnection became a testament to the love and hope that remained. Even when unacknowledged, these efforts held meaning. They were a declaration of care that required no response, no validation, no reciprocation. I began to understand that love, in its truest form, is often quiet, persistent, and patient. It doesn't always demand recognition, and its value is not diminished by silence. As I processed these realizations, I also confronted the anger that lingered beneath the surface. I acknowledged the resentment, the frustration, and the lingering questions that had haunted me for months. Rather than suppressing them, I explored them, writing them down, speaking them aloud in solitude, and examining them with honesty. In doing so, I discovered that anger, when understood and contextualized, can become a guide rather than a prison. It highlighted the depth of my care, the intensity of my attachment, and the significance of the bond that had been disrupted. I began to weave these reflections into a broader understanding of relationships. I realized that human connections are rarely linear or predictable. People change, circumstances evolve, and bonds can shift in ways beyond comprehension. Yet, even when relationships fracture or fade, the lessons they impart endure. I learned about empathy, patience, self-reflection, and resilience. I learned that absence can teach as much as presence, that distance can illuminate as clearly as closeness, and that love can persist in forms that are subtle, nuanced, and sometimes unseen. There were moments of quiet hope during this period. I imagined scenarios in which he might reach out, an unexpected message, a chance encounter, or even a small acknowledgement that bridged the silence. These imagined moments were not obsessive, they were gentle, sustaining, and reflective of a desire to maintain connection without demanding it. I learned to hold hope lightly, appreciating the possibility without allowing it to dominate my emotional landscape. It became a practice in balance, hope tempered by realism, longing softened by acceptance. I also began to recognize the patterns in my own emotional responses. I noticed how I had initially clung to expectation, how I had sought closure externally, and how I had intertwined my identity with his presence. This self-awareness was liberating. I realized that while I could not control his choices, I could control my reactions, my growth, and my capacity for compassion. The absence of my brother became a mirror, reflecting not only loss, but also opportunity, resilience, and the potential for profound personal insight. During this time, I started connecting with others who had experienced similar disconnections, friends, acquaintances, even online communities. Their stories resonated deeply, reminding me that I was not alone in feeling the pang of unexplained absence. Hearing others articulate similar experiences validated my emotions, reduced the isolation, and offered perspectives I hadn't considered. I began to see that while each relationship is unique, the struggles of love, loss, and distance are universal. This realization was both comforting and empowering, reinforcing the idea that growth often emerges from shared human experience. I also began revisiting old routines and rituals that had been tied to our shared past, listening to music we once loved, revisiting locations that held memories, and engaging in hobbies we had pursued together. All became exercises in reflection rather than longing. I learned to appreciate these activities for their intrinsic value, to honor the memories without becoming trapped by them. In doing so, I cultivated a sense of continuity, a thread connecting the past with the present, allowing me to carry the essence of our relationship forward even as its form had changed. Perhaps the most profound insight during this period was the realization that relationships, even when disrupted, leave enduring imprints on our hearts. My bond with my brother had shaped my values, my emotional responses, and my understanding of love and connection. While his absence created pain, it also illuminated growth, perspective, and self-awareness. I began to embrace the paradox: loss and love, grief and gratitude, absence and impact, intertwined in a way that defied simple resolution but offered profound understanding. It was during a quiet evening, sitting by the window with the soft hum of the city in the background, that I felt the full weight of our separation. I thought about him, not just the brother I had lost contact with, but the person he had become in his absence. I imagined his daily routines, the small victories and setbacks that shaped him, and the private thoughts he might never share. It was both painful and strangely comforting, like tracing the outline of someone I loved without being able to touch them. In that moment, I understood that love does not vanish simply because physical presence does. It transforms, sometimes quietly, sometimes painfully, but always persistently. I began to revisit our shared history more deliberately. I remembered late-night conversations where we had debated life, love, and our dreams. He had a way of speaking that made me feel understood, even when I didn't fully understand myself. There were days we would argue, stubbornly clinging to our perspectives, yet beneath the friction lay an unspoken bond that had always tethered us together. The contrast between those moments of closeness and the current silence was stark, almost unbearable. And yet, in that starkness, I found clarity. I realized that absence has a way of highlighting the depth of what was once present, forcing us to acknowledge what we often take for granted. In an effort to reconnect, I tried subtle forms of communication. I sent messages recalling old jokes, small reminders of shared experiences, and even links to songs that had once meant something to us both. I never demanded a response. I simply offered glimpses of myself, hoping that somehow they would reach him. Some messages went unanswered, some lingered without reaction, and others received brief acknowledgements that felt like drops of hope in a vast ocean of uncertainty. Each interaction, no matter how small, became a testament to persistence, patience, and the enduring nature of familial bonds. I also noticed my own transformation during this time. The pain of his absence forced me to confront parts of myself I had ignored, the impatience, the desire for control, the need for validation. I began to understand that relationships are mirrors, reflecting both our strengths and our vulnerabilities. His withdrawal was not only a challenge to our bond, but also an invitation to examine my own capacity for empathy, understanding, and resilience. The process was neither easy nor linear. Some days were filled with hope, others with despair, yet each step contributed to a deeper awareness of myself and the dynamics that had shaped our connection. One afternoon, I stumbled upon a box of old letters and drawings we had exchanged during our childhood. The nostalgia hit me like a wave, overwhelming and tender. I read through notes where we had confessed fears, dreams, and silly frustrations. I laughed, I cried, and I felt the presence of his spirit in those fragile pieces of paper. It was a reminder that relationships leave indelible marks on our lives, even when altered or interrupted. The physical distance could not erase the emotional resonance that had been built over years, and for the first time in a long while, I felt a sense of continuity, an acknowledgement that the bond, though tested, still existed in some form. During this period, I also reflected on the ways I had coped with his absence. Initially, I had sought closure externally, yearning for explanations, apologies, or reconciliation. But as months passed, I realized that closure is not always granted by others. It is often cultivated within oneself. I began writing letters I would never send, pouring out my thoughts, emotions, and reflections. I revisited memories both painful and joyful, examining them through the lens of empathy and self-awareness. The act of writing became therapeutic, allowing me to process grief, acknowledge love, and cultivate a sense of peace independent of his response. There were moments of unexpected insight. I began to understand that human behavior is rarely as straightforward as it appears. His choice to withdraw might have been influenced by factors I could not see, personal struggles, fears, or pressures that remained hidden. This perspective softened my resentment, allowing space for empathy without condoning his actions. I realized that relationships are shaped by countless invisible threads, some of which fray or break under circumstances beyond our control. Accepting this complexity was crucial in transforming my pain into understanding, my longing into reflection, and my grief into growth. I also explored the role of hope in this process. For a long time, hope had been a double-edged sword, simultaneously comforting and painful. I feared that holding on to it might trap me in perpetual expectation, yet abandoning it entirely felt impossible. Over time, I learned to cultivate a tempered hope, one that acknowledged uncertainty while allowing space for possibility. It was a delicate balance, imagining potential reconciliation without depending on it, valuing the relationship without being consumed by its absence. This refined perspective became a guiding principle, shaping how I approached not only my brother, but all significant relationships in my life. In parallel, I confronted my own patterns of attachment and expectation. I realized that my desire for answers had sometimes overshadowed the love I had for him. I had sought validation of my feelings rather than fully honoring his autonomy. Recognizing this dynamic was humbling, but it also opened a path toward emotional maturity. I began practicing patience, accepting ambiguity, and offering care without insisting on reciprocity. The absence of my brother, painful as it was, had inadvertently nurtured qualities of empathy, resilience, and emotional intelligence that I might not have developed otherwise. There were, of course, setbacks. Some days the grief and longing surged unexpectedly, triggered by a song, a scent, or a fleeting memory. Tears would come unbidden, and frustration would flare, but I learned to sit with these emotions rather than resist them, treating them as natural responses rather than signs of weakness. Each emotional wave, no matter how intense, became an opportunity for reflection and growth. I began to see that healing is not a linear process. It is a series of small, cumulative steps, interwoven with moments of reflection, acceptance, and gentle self-compassion. Finally, I began to imagine the future, not a fixed vision, but a spectrum of possibilities. I pictured scenarios where we might reconnect, conversations that could unfold, or even the quiet acknowledgement of one another's presence without fully restoring what had been lost. These imagined futures were not fantasies. They were exercises in hope, creativity, and emotional flexibility. I realized that imagining connection, even in uncertainty, allowed me to carry the bond forward in a way that was healthy, sustainable, and emotionally constructive. I remember one particularly heavy evening when the weight of absence felt almost unbearable. I sat in my room, the dim light casting shadows across familiar surfaces, and I allowed myself to feel the full magnitude of what had changed. The quiet was deafening, punctuated only by the hum of the heater and the occasional rustle of pages from a book I had left open. In that silence, memories surged, every joke we shared, every fight we had, every moment of unspoken understanding. It struck me that love and pain were now inseparably intertwined, each defining the other in ways I hadn't anticipated. As I sat with these emotions, I began to confront the regrets that lingered. I thought about the times I had been impatient with him, the moments I had dismissed his feelings, and the arguments that had escalated unnecessarily. I acknowledged the subtle ways I may have contributed to the distance between us, not to assign blame, but to understand, to learn, and to grow. Regret, I realized, is not a punishment, but a teacher. It illuminates the areas where we can evolve, where we can nurture empathy, patience, and humility. Facing it directly was painful, but it was also liberating. I also confronted the anger that had simmered beneath the surface for months, the frustration of his silence, the ache of unanswered questions, the sense of injustice. It all demanded recognition. I allowed myself to feel it fully, without judgment, and then examined it closely. I realized that anger is often rooted in love, the intensity of care, the depth of expectation, the desire for reciprocity. By understanding this, I could begin to release the destructive edge of my anger while preserving its instructive value. It became less about resentment and more about insight, a lens through which I could view both our relationship and myself with clarity. I began exploring the idea that closure is not always external. For months, I had sought explanations, confrontations, or apologies from him, believing that peace would only arrive with his acknowledgement. But slowly I realized that closure is often self-generated, a process of reflection, understanding, and emotional reconciliation. By reframing my expectations, I could release the pressure on him and, more importantly, reclaim my own sense of equilibrium. This internal closure didn't negate my desire to reconnect. It simply allowed me to live fully, regardless of the outcome. One evening, I found myself rereading letters I had written but never sent. Each page captured fragments of longing, frustration, and love, a testament to the persistence of my feelings and the depth of my connection. As I read, I felt a mixture of sadness and gratitude. Sadness for what had been lost, and gratitude for having experienced such a bond at all. It dawned on me that relationships, even when disrupted, leave enduring imprints that shape our character, influence our decisions, and inform our understanding of love and empathy. This recognition was both humbling and affirming. I also contemplated the broader lessons of absence. I realized that relationships are rarely straightforward. They are influenced by unspoken fears, personal struggles, and the complexities of human emotion. People may withdraw, intentionally or unintentionally, for reasons that remain hidden. Accepting this reality was essential to my healing. It taught me that love does not demand presence, that understanding can exist without explanation, and that patience is often the most profound expression of care. In embracing these truths, I found a sense of stability that had eluded me for months. In the midst of this reflection, I began to cultivate empathy for my brother, not in a way that excused his silence, but in a way that acknowledged the complexity of his choices. I imagined his perspective, the pressures he faced, the emotions he may have struggled to articulate. This exercise in perspective-taking was transformative. It allowed me to release lingering judgments, to approach the relationship with openness, and to understand that human bonds are fragile yet resilient, imperfect yet profoundly meaningful. Finally, I arrived at a place of emotional equilibrium. The pain of absence, the sting of unanswered questions, and the pull of longing remained, but they no longer defined me. I had discovered that reconciliation, whether literal or metaphorical, is not always about restoring what once was. It can be about understanding, growth, and the quiet persistence of love. I learned that even in absence, relationships continue to shape us, guide us, and teach us about resilience, empathy, and the enduring power of connection. The final months of this journey felt like navigating through both fog and sunlight simultaneously. I had come to accept the reality of his absence, but I refused to let it define the entirety of my existence. I had learned to carry the weight of longing with dignity, to balance hope with realism, and to honor both my grief and my growth. Each day became an exercise in mindful presence, acknowledging emotions as they arose without letting them dictate my actions or sense of self. In doing so, I began to experience a sense of liberation I had never anticipated, a freedom that came not from his return, but from my own acceptance. I reflected deeply on the nature of familial bonds. Sibling relationships, I realized, are unique. They combine elements of friendship, rivalry, mentorship, and unconditional love in ways that no other connection mirrors. We grow up intertwined, learning from each other, challenging each other, and sometimes frustrating each other to the point of tears. The shared history becomes a tapestry of experiences, some bright and vivid, others dark and confusing. What I had experienced with my brother was both ordinary and extraordinary, a complex, enduring bond that shaped me profoundly, even in silence. In this period of reflection, I found myself letting go of the compulsion to control the outcome. I could no longer dictate whether he would reach out, acknowledge the distance, or seek reconciliation, and strangely, this release of control brought peace. I understood that love is not possession, and that connection does not require continuous proximity. By relinquishing the expectation of reciprocity, I allowed myself to cultivate a love that was patient, forgiving, and enduring, even if unseen, unspoken, or unacknowledged. I began to see our story as a lesson in the complexity of human relationships. It was not a narrative of failure or betrayal, but a narrative of growth, understanding, and resilience. Absence had forced me to confront my vulnerabilities, my patterns of expectation, and my own emotional limits. It had also shown me the depth of my capacity for empathy, patience, and reflection. I began to appreciate that relationships are living, evolving entities. They may fracture, fade, or transform, but their impact persists in ways both subtle and profound. One evening, I revisited a place we had frequented as teenagers, a small park near the edge of town, where the light fell softly across the swings and the old wooden benches. I imagined him there, perhaps thinking of me, perhaps not, and I felt a strange comfort in the possibility of shared memory. I traced our old paths, recalled the laughter, the arguments, and the quiet moments of understanding that had defined our youth. In this exercise, I recognized that physical absence could not erase the imprint of shared experience. Our relationship, though altered, remained a part of the fabric of my life, influencing my choices, my emotions, and my understanding of love. I also began to envision a future where we might reconnect, not necessarily to restore what was lost, but to create something new. I imagined conversations filled with honesty, laughter, and perhaps even tears. I pictured the tentative steps of rebuilding trust, acknowledging past pain, and embracing the reality of change. These imagined interactions were exercises in hope, not dependency. They allowed me to cultivate patience, maintain empathy, and hold space for connection without insisting on its immediate manifestation. Through this journey, I discovered the importance of narrative, the stories we tell ourselves about relationships, absence, and love. Initially, my narrative was dominated by questions. Why did he leave? What did I do wrong? Over time, I reframed the story. I acknowledged the complexity of human behavior, the influence of unseen circumstances, and the inevitability of growth and change. By reshaping my narrative, I transformed my emotional experience from one of confusion and pain to one of reflection, acceptance, and insight. The story was still my story, but it was no longer dictated solely by absence. It included growth, hope, and self-awareness as well. I also reflected on the lessons of patience and resilience. Waiting for answers or reconciliation is not idle. It is active engagement with uncertainty, a cultivation of empathy, and a training of emotional endurance. I realized that relationships often test our patience not to punish us, but to foster growth, perspective, and understanding. My brother's absence, painful as it was, had become a teacher, revealing the strength of my heart, the depth of my capacity for care, and the beauty of hope tempered by realism. There were moments of unexpected clarity during this period. I recognized that reconciliation, if it ever occurred, would not erase the past, but it could integrate it. Acceptance did not mean forgetting, it meant acknowledging history, honoring experiences, and building forward from a place of understanding rather than resentment. I began to imagine a scenario where we could meet again, not to rewrite history, but to embrace its lessons and to forge a connection that was conscious, intentional, and compassionate. This vision became a lodestar, guiding my emotions and offering a sense of purpose amid uncertainty. I also explored gratitude in ways I hadn't previously considered. I felt gratitude for our shared past, for the laughter, for the lessons learned, and for the enduring impact of our relationship. I recognized that even in absence, love leaves gifts, memories that teach, experiences that shape, and emotional growth that persists. Gratitude transformed my perspective, allowing me to hold both joy and sorrow simultaneously. It became a lens through which I could view our relationship with honesty, appreciation, and acceptance. In reflecting on the journey as a whole, I realized that absence had revealed the true measure of connection. Love is not contingent on constant contact. Care does not require validation. Bonds are not always visible to the eye, yet they endure in the heart. I learned that relationships are not solely defined by presence, but by the influence they exert on our character, our choices, and our emotional resilience. My brother's absence had been a catalyst for self-discovery, emotional depth, and the cultivation of enduring love in its most patient and nuanced form. Finally, I arrived at a place of calm, tempered hope, and acceptance. I understood that I may never fully grasp the reasons for his distance, and that the answers I seek may remain forever elusive. Yet, I also understood that this uncertainty does not diminish the value of our relationship, nor does it negate the love I feel. I could carry both grief and gratitude, absence and memory, longing and hope, all at once. This coexistence became a testament to the complexity of human relationships and the resilience of the human heart. In the quiet moments, I could imagine a future in which our bond, altered yet enduring, continued to shape my life. I could picture conversations, laughter, and shared understanding, but I no longer required them to define my present. I had learned that relationships are living, evolving, and sometimes unpredictable. The lessons of patience, empathy, reflection, and resilience were gifts I would carry forever, and in this acceptance I found peace, a recognition that love, even in absence, endures, transforms, and teaches in ways both subtle and profound.